We now move on to discussing Ludwig van Beethoven, our third final composer from the classical era. Beethoven lived from 1770 until 1827. There is so much that can be said about Beethoven. He's a phenomenal character and really helped to create amazing music that led us forward into the next eras. He is today still considered one of the greatest composers to ever live. This lecture only serves as a basic introduction to his life. If you want to learn more, there are some phenomenal books out there about his life. Feel free to invest in them and read about his life, because I really truly feel that this man was one of the greatest composers and one of the most wonderful human beings of all time. This is Ludwig van Beethoven. It's a painting done after he had gone completely deaf and still wrote music. But let's start with his early life. He was born in Bonn, Germany, and by age 11 he was an assistant to the court organist, and by 12 had published music as a composer. He was no child prodigy like Mozart, but at age 16 he performed for Mozart, and after Mozart heard him play, he was famous for saying that everyone needed to keep his eyes on Beethoven, because someday Beethoven would give the world something to talk about. Little did Mozart know how very much Beethoven would give us to talk about. At the age of 21, Beethoven left Bonn for more opportunity in, of course, Vienna, the art capital of the world at the time. He settled there and lived there for the rest of his life. His life in Vienna was unexpected because Beethoven was the first composer to ever survive without patronage. He worked very, very hard and composed a lot of music in the first years he lived in the city. While he was doing this, he also gave music lessons and performed tons of music. He played so many concerts and managed to make enough money that he survived, was able to live in a decent home, and fed himself. He took music lessons in these early years with Joseph Haydn and other great composers of the time. So, think about his life for a moment. He not only knew the two greatest composers of the era, but he was surrounded by them and other composers of the time in the greatest epicenter of art of the period. Beethoven had everything going for him, including a fantastically vibrant and very determined personality. Because of his presence and his music, Vienna loved him. He dazzled them with his virtuosity and his genius as a performer, and as they got to know his music as a composer, they loved him even more. But Beethoven was different, even than Haydn and Mozart, in that he believed musicians should be a servant to no one. They should be able to work on their own terms. For the first time in history, Beethoven proved everyone wrong and managed to survive very well and actually become quite rich as a free, successful musician. So remember, Haydn was a skilled servant of the court. Mozart started as a servant of the court, tried to make it as a free musician, and failed and died in poverty and sickness. But Beethoven comes along later in the period and manages to surprise everyone and break from the tradition of the patronage system and the skilled servantry of the court and live a free, successful, beautiful life as a musician. He paved the way for composers and musicians to break with the tradition and build careers. Surprisingly, it was the aristocracy that helped him make this happen. One would have thought that the aristocracy would have wanted to keep control over Beethoven, but they respected his talent and his beliefs, and they knew what he could do. They knew what he represented as a new voice in music. So they helped him by commissioning works and paying him for his performances, but allowing him the freedom to live his own life. Yet Beethoven's life was not entirely a bed of roses. Disaster struck at the age of 29 when Beethoven began to go deaf. Imagine being a musician, a composer, and a performer, and losing your hearing. Nothing could be done to save his hearing. It took years for him to realize that this was the case. He visited so many doctors and tried so very many things to save his hearing, but it simply couldn't happen. In 1802, Beethoven went to the countryside for a vacation in Heiligenstadt, Austria. It was at this particular place that he decided he had to come to terms with the loss of his hearing and what it would mean for his career as a musician. Unfortunately, Beethoven despaired so greatly that he decided that there was no way that he could live without his hearing. He wrote a letter, a testament to his family. It was a suicide note that asked for their forgiveness and understanding. This testament, today known as the Heiligenstadt Testament, is one of the most famous pieces of written musical history that there is. Yet all was not actually lost, because by the end of writing the letter, Beethoven had had a change of heart. He writes, "I would have ended my life. It was only my art that held me back. Ah, it seemed to me impossible to leave the world until I had brought forth all that I felt was in me." What a beautiful sentiment. Beethoven couldn't take his own life because he believed he had so much music within him that had to be written so the world could hear it, that he could not lose his life before it was out of him. He had too much music still to give to the world. His triumph over his own despair and his hearing loss led to a change in his musical style. We'll talk about those musical styles really quickly in the next lecture. There are a few other things to know about Beethoven. His loss of hearing changed him into a very strange and yet very passionate man. Before he lost his hearing, he was emotional, and he cared very much about his music. He believed music to be a philosophy, not necessarily simply music. But after he began to lose his hearing, he became even more emotional, and this was heard in his music. Once he became truly, completely deaf, his music got more and more complicated and ahead of his time. He conducted and performed after he lost hearing, but since he could not hear his performances or the music being conducted, he was never able to recapture the virtuosic performance level of his youth and finally stopped performing in public at the age of 44. He composed many masterpieces late in his life despite the loss of his hearing and mounting personal problems in his own life. Some of these masterpieces include his epic Ninth Symphony and the late string quartets. Beethoven was very famous even at the point of his death in 1827.